Ruin is one of the hack's teachable perks. It first appeared in the game on the 8th of December 2016 and it instantly attracted a lot of attention. Not only because it was one of the 3 first hacks perks, but also because it was designed to slow down the gen speed.
Just a little bit.
Not that it was the first perk with this effect, because by that time killers already had Dying Light, but it was so hard to get it to work that Ruin instantly overshadowed it. However, this doesn't automatically mean that Ruin was good at release. In its original form, this perk didn't regress the gens that weren't being worked on. Instead, it made the repair progress a little more tedious. This was achieved by replacing the normal generator skill checks with the special Ruin skill checks. To make him stand out and instill the sense of danger in players, the devs gave them a unique red and black color scheme. Were they actually dangerous? Well, hitting a good skill check used to result in the 5% regression on the gen and pause the progress bar for 3 seconds. Hitting a great skill check did nothing, literally. No extra progression, but also no regression. You were just allowed to continue fixing the gen uninterrupted. And that's pretty much all there was to it. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see the problem behind this concept. If the survivor was good at hitting great skill checks, it allowed them to completely bypass Ruin and fix gens like it wasn't even there. It wasn't always easy to do, cause sometimes great skill checks spawned so close to the arrow, you would need a bullet time vision to hit them. Another 3 o'clock, man. Like, how am I supposed to hit a 3 o'clock skill check? What? But for the most part, it was definitely possible. But even if you couldn't hit a great skill check to save your life and only went for good ones, it didn't really matter. The reason being super fast gen speed. At that time, repairing one gen solo from start to finish used to take only 70 seconds. And let's guesstimate, how many skill checks can the game give you in such a short period of time? 6? 7? Okay, let's be generous and say 8. That's 40% of lost progress, which sounds scary, but really that's only 8 seconds longer than fixing a full gen in the current version of the game. Surely we can't forget about the freezing progress bar after good skill checks, because with 8 of them it meant an additional 24 seconds of repair time. But honestly, even this wasn't that big of an issue, because you could easily compensate for it by using a toolbox. Back in the day, toolboxes were way stronger than today. Just so you understand, that's how fast you could fix a gen if you brought a brand new part. Something very balanced is about to happen. What? Yeah, there you go. If you want to know more about old toolboxes as well as gen rush in general, let me know in the comments and I'll make a separate video about it. Also, while you're down there, you might as well click that subscribe button. I mean, you were gonna do that anyway, right? So why scroll twice? Anyway, with all that said, you might get the impression that every other survivor liked to abuse good skill checks against the old Ruin. Well, that's not quite true. The thing is, originally Ruin used to make gens spark after good skill checks, just like they do after normal missed skill checks, except it didn't throw the survivor away from the gen. And since missing a skill check reveals the survivor's position to the killer through an explosion, people automatically started assuming the same about good Ruin skill checks. However, that wasn't the case, because it was just a visual effect indicating the 5% regression. And once survivors started learning about this, more and more of them started brute forcing gens through good skill checks. But let's get back to our math. Imagine that while dealing with Ruin, the survivor got lucky with the RNG and got, let's say, 2 skill checks. That's like what, 10 seconds of regression? Freaking unnerving presence would be more useful at this point. Some of you might say that 2 skill checks per gen is an unrealistic scenario, and to this I'm gonna respond, you clearly started playing DBD after 2019. Otherwise you would know that before then the skill check RNG was so broken that sometimes 2 skill checks were actually quite the reality. In fact, sometimes it was even worse, or better, depending on which side you were playing. Cause I remember quite a few times when I managed to fix a gen without any skill checks at all.
Good luck getting any value out of your Ruin with this.
But to be fair, the opposite scenario was quite common too. Sometimes the game started spamming skill checks, making it pretty much impossible to achieve any meaningful progression with just good skill checks. Nothing, it's not giving me... It gives me a 4 o'clock just as I'm saying this. Oh, that was awkward. Okay, I didn't even hear this. What do you mean, man? Like, why? Stop spamming! That's when gen tapping came into play. Gen tapping is a now dead survivor tag that was used to quickly stop gens from regressing. It was based on the fact that before patch 7.5.0, the game didn't require survivors to repair at least 5% of a gen in order for it to stop sparking. So they could simply touch it for a split second and then immediately let go, and that was enough to make the killer come back and waste time kicking it again. Cocky survivors love to do it right in the middle of a chase, making the killer's butt blast off into the stratosphere from helplessness and frustration. In the case of Ruin, doing it multiple times in a row allowed you to avoid getting any skill checks whatsoever, because a skill check can only appear after about a second of being on the gen. So if you weren't too greedy and kept cancelling the repair animation quickly enough, you simply didn't give them enough time to pop up. Sometimes you could hear the audio cue like it was about to happen, like this. No. Not anymore, man, not anymore. But that's about it. At first glance, it might seem like it was a huge oversight on the devs' part. But frankly speaking, doing it wasn't that beneficial for survivors, because completing a gen this way took them 2.5 minutes, which was roughly the same as if they chose to repair it normally while only going for good skill checks. So I always found it funny when people tried to prove to me that gen tapping was the ultimate ruin counter. If anything, it helped ruin serve its purpose even better, because unlike when survivors were actually trying to power through it with skill checks, it implied a guaranteed slowdown. Basically, it made sense to start tapping only if the gen was super close to being finished and you didn't want to risk rolling it back with a random skill check. To sum it up, Ruin was all about RNG. One match it could be godlike and waste an insane amount of the survivor's time, and the next it wouldn't do anything, making the killer regret they brought this perk in the first place. And that's not even to mention that like all hex perks, it could be cleansed and thus removed from the killer's build until the end of the match, which by the way was much easier to do than today. You know how today killers complain that hex perks are too unreliable because survivors find totems too quickly? Well, in the old DBD, totem placement was so much worse that sometimes the game didn't even bother to hide them at all. No, this is beautiful, man. This is like Look at this. Look. It's like what? Like how do you not find this ruin, man? Like what? What is this? So if you wanted your ruin to last longer than the match intro animation, you absolutely had to be prepared to defend it. With how big the maps used to be at that time, doing it wasn't quite easy, and sometimes I'd say even impossible. And the devs understood it, which is why along with Ruin, they introduced a new free perk which was meant to help Ruin last a little longer. I'm of course talking about Thrill of the Hunt. In its original form, this perk worked like Devour Hope, giving you a token each time a survivor was unhooked with you standing at least 24 meters away from them. Each token granted you 8% bonus blood points for actions in the Hunter category, and most importantly reduced the cleansing speed by 10%. Just like today, the maximum number of tokens was capped at 5, meaning that the overall cleansing speed penalty could go up to 50%, or 6 seconds. Seems solid, right? But don't get too excited. The thing is, just like Ruin and Devour Hope, Thrill of the Hunt is also a hex perk, meaning that survivors could get rid of it too. And sometimes they did it even before you could get any tokens. But it didn't stop killers from bringing it, cause first, even without any tokens, it still served as a decoy, making survivors guess which one of the 2 totems they had to break to get rid of Ruin. And second, cause back then it was the only totem protection tool, so it was either Thrill of the Hunt or nothing. 4 months later, with the release of patch 1.5.0, behavior doubled down on the Ruin protection meta by giving Thrill of the Hunt a significant buff. Namely, they made it so that tokens were no longer obtained through letting survivors unhook each other, but were instead applied for all the remaining totems on the map. This completely reversed the usage logic of this perk. Instead of starting weak and getting stronger over time, it was at its strongest right from the start of the match when you needed it the most, and gradually became weaker as survivors were breaking the totems. But that's only half of the buff. Additionally, the devs made Thrill of the Hunt mark the hex totem survivors started cleansing with an explosion, similar to when they miss a skill check while sitting on a gen. This made it extremely easy to chase them away from totems, especially if you were playing a high mobility killer such as the Nurse. In fact, as the Nurse, if Ruin and Thrill of the Hunt spawned close to each other, you could make it virtually impossible to get rid of either of them, because the rate at which you would be blinking back and forth would leave survivors absolutely no chance to get even close to breaking them. If you went against such an adamant totem defender, you had to be really creative to outplay them. One of the ways was to start tapping one of the totems in order to create a massive wave of explosions on the killer's end, and when they decided to check what the hell you were doing there, you were supposed to run away. Once they were gone, you needed to come back and do it again, and again, and again, until at some point they finally got tired of running back and forth and gave up, allowing you to break the totem for free. If you were playing in a team on comms, it was even easier, because you could tell 2 of your teammates to go to different parts of the map and start spamming rushed actions like fast vaulting or jumping in and out of lockers. Just like in the previous case, the goal was to overwhelm the killer with the noise, and as this was happening, you and the remaining survivor were supposed to simultaneously start cleansing both of the totems. This way, the notifications from Thrill of the Hunt would blend with all the explosions produced by your teammates. This made it harder for the killer to spot the exact moment when you started cleansing the totems, which increased your chances of actually breaking them. But even if they did spot it, the situation was still not in their favor, because while you were trying to break both of their totems at the same time, they could only defend one of them. And guess what? They had absolutely no idea which one to go for, because the auras of both Thrill of the Hunt and Ruin were highlighted with the same color. So whichever totem they chose, there was always a 50% chance that they were trying to protect Thrill of the Hunt, while the other survivor was destroying their ruin. 1 month later, in order to humble aggressive ruin defenders, the devs reduced the cleansing speed penalty of Thrill of the Hunt to 6% per token. However, it didn't change the situation much, and people still continued using it with ruin just like before. As the average skill level of survivors grew, ruin became less and less dangerous for them. However, the devs weren't in much of a hurry to buff this perk. Instead, they focused on improving the base kit gen defense, which I find smart, because gen defense is a very important aspect of the killer gameplay, and making it 100% depend on one specific paid perk was just unfair, and honestly even predatory. For this, they released several updates which made gens go from taking 70 seconds to complete and not being able to regress at all to taking 80 seconds to complete and being able to regress all the way back to 0. Later, they will add even more cool stuff to counter gen rush, but again, we're gonna talk about it in a separate video. After these updates, they started making the first steps towards actually fixing ruin. The first thing they did was make sure that it was no longer so easy to find. This was achieved by slightly improving the hiding spots of totems in patch 2.5.0. Yes, this change wasn't specifically aimed at ruin. However, since it was the most popular hex perk at that time, it certainly benefited the most from it. Ever since then, it has become a recurring practice for Behavior to occasionally revisit their maps and slightly reshuffle the most obvious totem spots. Next, around this time, Behavior changed the balance between the 3 tiers of ruin. Originally, they differed in how many survivors they affected. Tier 1 affected 2 survivors, Tier 2 3 survivors, and Tier 3 all 4. Patch 2.6.0 made it affect all survivors across all tiers, but as a trade-off changed the regression percentage from a steady 5% to a variable 3, 4, and 5 respectively. Obviously, such humble changes couldn't cut it, and that's why in the early 2020, Behavior decided to do a complete rework of ruin. Instead of making it rely on skill checks, they changed it so that any generator not being worked on would gradually lose its repair progress over time. This is pretty much how it works today, except back then it had a higher regression rate of 200%. Personally, it was my favorite version of ruin, because first it gave killers the incentive to camp less and walk around the map more, otherwise you simply wouldn't be able to benefit from it. And second, as the killer, it saved you a lot of time on kicking gens, and thus made the game more dynamic for both sides. But at the same time, it wasn't too overpowered, because just like before, survivors could still get rid of it by breaking the associated totem. However, 8 months later, with the release of a new hex perk Undying, this situation changed radically. Just like today, the first version of this perk was designed to protect your other hex totems. However, it did it much more aggressively. As long as it remained active, if someone cleansed any other of your hexes, Undying kept transferring it to other dull totems, making survivors look for them over and over again until they either found Undying or you simply ran out of dull totems. And it was just a perfect gift for all ruin enjoyers, because just like that, with no extra effort, it could automatically double, triple, or even quadruple the lifespan of this perk. In fact, with the ever-increasing difficulty to find totems, in some cases ruin became literally impossible to get rid of. Not that it didn't allow survivors to progress the game at all, it's just it turned a standard 10 minutes match into a 20-minute standoff, especially if some of the survivors were already dead or the killer had a super nasty 3-gen setup. What made this situation even worse was that originally Undying revealed the auras of survivors standing within 2 meters of both hex and dull totems for 6 seconds, which made controlling hexes even easier than with Thrill of the Hunt. This explains why after the introduction of Undying, the popularity of Thrill of the Hunt started rapidly declining, until it eventually became only the 70th most used killer perk in the game. Several months later, the devs realized that by making Undying so ridiculously strong, they had opened a Pandora's box, which is why they decided to nerf it. Patch 4.5.0 introduced a whole bunch of changes to this perk, but for the sake of brevity, we're only gonna cover the 2 of them that are directly related to ruin. First, now Undying could transfer other hexes only once, after which it would immediately deactivate. This way, it couldn't carry ruin for free the whole match, and allowed survivors to get rid of it in a reasonable time. Second, it no longer revealed survivors' auras near hex totems, only near dull totems, which gave survivors a chance to approach ruin unnoticed. What's interesting is that all these nerfs still didn't make killers give up on Undying, and they continued using it with ruin all the way until the summer of 2022, when Behavior freaked out and completely killed ruin as part of their first meta shakeup update. Basically, they halved the regression speed of ruin, making it the same as when killers damaged gens manually. It was a pretty significant nerf even by itself, but they didn't stop there and also made it deactivate after the first survivor was killed. And that's just case in point of Behavior overreacting and trying to balance things by changing something completely unrelated. The problem of the 200% ruin wasn't ruin itself, it was its synergy with Undying, so why didn't you simply make these perks unstackable? Didn't want to make an exception for one specific hex perk? Alright, then you could have just nerfed the regression speed while keeping everything else as it was. It would have worked perfectly, because this way, even if survivors allowed ruin to last the entire match, it would be no more annoying than dealing with your average Verge Shadow Dance Brutal Strength Wraith. Or if you really like the idea of Ruin deactivating after the first kill, you could have simply taken away its status as a Hex perk and make it work like the current version of Corrupt Intervention. But no, you really had to do everything at once and completely butcher this perk. The outcome of all this was predictable. People instantly forgot about Ruin and switched to other, more reliable gen defense perks. And I can't blame them for this, cause who's gonna want to run a weak perk that doesn't just deactivate as soon as you do good, but can also be preemptively removed from your build if survivors know where to look for totems. Despite killers being absolutely furious about what happened to their favorite perk, for almost 2 years behavior was in complete denial that they did something wrong. And I don't know what changed, but recently in patch 7.5.0 they suddenly decided to reverse the nerf. Not all of it of course, but at least the deactivate after the first kill portion of it. Can't say that it restored killers' faith in this perk, and I understand why. At this point the game offers much better gen defense options, and nobody wants to limit themselves to a perk that's almost 8 years old. However, what people seem to overlook is the fact that Ruin is currently the only gen defense perk which allows to bypass the regression event limit. A regression event is when the killer damages a gen for 2.5% or more, and once they do it 8 times the gen gets blocked and can no longer be regressed. And since Ruin applies gen regression gradually, it doesn't count towards the event limit, which allows you to keep regressing gens as much as you want. Personally, I think that Ruin is one step away from becoming meta again. All it's lacking at the moment is a little more regression speed. In my opinion, 150% would be the perfect value. This way, even if people start using it with Undying, it wouldn't be as annoying to deal with as before. Though I don't think that behavior is gonna go for this in the near future. They're probably still having PTSD from the early Ruin Undying meta.